The next item of business today is a members' business debate on motion number 7824 in the name of Richard Lyle on the 50th anniversary of the JFK assassination. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put. I invite members who wish to speak in this debate to press the request to speak buttons now or as soon as possible. Mr Lyle, 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Firstly, can I thank all members of the Scottish Parliament who supported this motion that allowed this debate today, and I welcome to the Chamber Zsuzsa Bazarnik, Principal Officer, US Consul General, and thank my American intern, Dana Cullen, who aided me in this speech. Today we remember former US President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Tomorrow, 22nd of November, marks the 50th anniversary of his tragic assassination. I want to take this opportunity to reflect on President Kennedy's accomplishments as one of the most noteworthy political leaders of the 20th century. Having served just over 1,000 days in office, America's youngest elected president was shot dead on November 27, 1963, while driving in his presidential limousine through Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas. A shock to all. Most people of my generation remember where they were on that fateful day. Kennedy's assassination has been the focus of conspiracy, mystery, intrigue for the past 50 years. Countless books, articles, films, research have analysed, debated and produced unsatisfying results as to why a man with such an enormous promise met a most untimely death. Questions over the gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald. Did he act alone? How many bullets were fired and where the shots were fired from continue to plague those fascinated by President Kennedy and the almost Shakespearean drama that surrounded his life, family and legacy. A recent newspaper article actually commented on the conversation that President Kennedy had with his wife Jackie on the morning of his death, where he actually foreshadowed the exact means of his death. In those 50 years, official reports claimed 3 bullets, 1 man, and ultimately that his death was a result of a horrible, random act of violence. But the public has been unable to accept this, continually searching to give his life meaning and unable to believe that such a historic figure could be brought down by one lowly man. I find this as a testament to the man that JFK was and his accomplishments as a political figure. The theories around his death, while provoking, ultimately detract from his presidency and the accomplishments that I would like to draw our attention to. Prior to being sworn into office, Kennedy had already received a Purple Heart for service in World War II, as well as a Pulitzer Prize for his non-fictional book, Profiles in Courage. He was a young, exuberant and handsome man with a glamorous wife that made him and his family fit for celebrity. This, combined with his wit, intellect and charisma, led perfectly to an age of television. He easily defeated Nixon in the first televised presidential debates and was the first president to use the television to address the American people. Through these means, he was able to connect to the public and appeal to Americans on a personal and emotional basis. He has been described as unique ability to combine substance with style and wisdom, especially concerning significant issues such as war, peace, space and civil rights. As with most presidencies, Kennedy faced turbulent times, namely the Cuban Missile Crisis, the early years of the Vietnam War and the construction of the Berlin Wall. However, through these political obstacles, he emerged to initiate the first Apollo mission to the Moon, displaying his visionary spirit. In terms of foreign policy, he was instrumental in negotiating a nuclear weapons test ban treaty with the Soviet Union and the United Kingdom, and he committed to a phased withdrawal of US troops from Vietnam. In line with containing hostile relations, his presidency gave birth to the Peace Corps, and he was the first president to vocalise support for the civil rights movement. He drafted the Civil Rights Act, which called for an end to voter discrimination, segregation of schools and other forms of discrimination. These achievements were the result of a mere 22 months in office, which begs the question, what may he have done had he lived? Some suggest that Kennedy's popularity among current politicians and the public alike is based more on the promise of what may have been had the reality of his short term. Historian Dr. James Boyes has said that more than any other president, JFK was judged to a great extent on his promise as opposed to his specific achievements in office. But whilst this may be true, we must not overlook or undermine undermined the sense of joy Kennedy brought to the presidency, which ultimately convinced the public of his greatness. He served at a time where cynicism towards the White House was at a minimum, which perhaps helps to explain the longing for the days of Kennedy's Camelot. He was a man the public could stand behind and support through his handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy emerged as a heroic leader. Both Republicans and Democrats in America have sought to bask in the glory of Kennedy, often seen trying to emulate his speeches and drawing him as a symbol. As we all know, finding common ground between these parties is nothing less than extraordinary and speaks to the importance of Kennedy's presidency. Unfortunately, many politicians today have failed to realise that Kennedy's public image and persona were not just for his appearance, but a real substance as the basis. Had Kennedy continued to live, he would surely been elected to a second term. Kennedy's presidency was on track to be a champion of the civil rights movement, promote peaceful relations abroad, especially with the Soviet Union. And Vietnam may have taken a far different course, as he was adamant not to commit more troops to ground. But these possibilities we will never know. We will continue to wonder what may have been thinking of Kennedy and lamenting the loss. Kennedy's death has forever shaped how we remember him. But instead of remembering him for the miss of his death or his unrealised potential, remember him for the man who inspired a nation. Remember him for the spirit he brought to the presidency, for the accomplishments he achieved in such a short time, as a symbol for peaceful diplomacy and for the duty he gave to his country. I will end with an excerpt written in the following weeks of his death that aptly captures the essence of the late President. This excerpt was also on display in a recent Andy Warhol display in this Parliament. And so the 35th President of the United States was laid to rest. The 4 days that shocked the world came to an end, and the great and the near great from around the world turned back to their own worlds. In all the speeches and all the eulogies and all the comforting messages, nowhere was the world sentiment more clearly expressed. And a brief inscription in the back of a picture of the late President, which was handed out at St Matthew's Cathedral. Dear God, please take care of our servant, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Sadly, years later, his wife, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, died at 10:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the 19th of the 5th, 1994, of cancer at her Fifth Avenue apartment in New York. So ended the Kennedy dynasty.
Thank you very much. Now calling Christine Graham to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm. 4 minutes or thereby, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. It's a cliché to ask, where were you when Kennedy was assassinated? But some of us have a reply. So I asked some colleagues. John Pentland was in a house listening to the radio. He couldn't be more specific, or perhaps he was just being evasive. Roderick Campbell pled the Fifth Amendment. Nanette Milne was in the medical school library at Forester Hill in Aberdeen. Mini-skirted Mary Scanlon was back combing her hair in Montrose, ready to go to the Locarno to dance to Brian Poole and the Tremolos, and it had been cancelled. It was cancelled. Elaine Murray was playing with her junior chemistry set, listening to the radio. I was in the Cameo Picture House, also in a miniskirt, watching a Jacques Tati film when the film stopped. We thought the projector had broken, and then across the black screen came the words, "John F. Kennedy has been assassinated." Stunned to silence, the cinema emptied, without any instruction to do so, and I felt the world was a very bad place. Why? When JFK became president, it seemed a new world had a chance. He was charismatic and refreshing, with his stylish wife and charming children. The court of Camelot, as the White House and entourage became known, seemed a breath of fresh air and promised so much to this impressionable teenager. An end to wars for a start. Of course, wars continued, even up to today, and I recall what became known as the Cuban crisis, the 13-day confrontation in October 1962 between the Soviet Union and Cuba on one side and the United States on the other. The crisis now is generally regarded as the moment in which the Cold War became closest to turning into a nuclear conflict, and is indeed also the first documented instance of mutual assured destruction, aptly shortened to MAD, being discussed as a determining factor in a major international arms agreement. MAD, how appropriate. I truly thought then that World War III was inevitable. It was a chilling moment. Of course, the Camelot court was not as clean as a whistle, and the idyllic family was not so idyllic. But these were the days before the internet, texting, 24-hour news, satellite broadcasting, people documenting events with their own mobile phones. And when I review the reality of the Kennedy years, some good, some bad, with the benefit of historical appraisals, we recognise JFK's achievements, but sometimes it's chalk and cheese. But it does not detract from the promise snuffed out so brutally. If we compare this with the election of Barack Obama, and not simply that president's means of reaching an electorate and funding, but some of those hopes on the shoulders of JFK seem to transfer and come alive again with the current First Family. But this current personable, eloquent president, though exuding some of the glamour and style, to Western eyes at least, has a much tougher time from his electorate and the Fourth Estate. This is not necessarily a bad thing, though the results may sometimes depress us. But how would a JFK and his family have fared today by comparison? The assassination of JFK is and remains a seminal moment in international history, followed some 5 years later with the assassination of Martin Luther King and in the same year, Bobby Kennedy. These three murders put a brutal stop to the influence of three substantial figures and, for the very young Christine Graham, the promise of a different and better world.
Many thanks. Now call on Malcolm Chisholm to be followed by David Torrance.
Presiding Officer, I'd like to congratulate Richard Lyle for introducing this debate and also welcome the American Consul to the gallery. I tweeted last week that everyone of a certain age would be obsessed with the assassination of JFK this week, and not surprisingly, because everyone can remember where they were on the night of Friday, the 22nd of November 1963. I can go further than that. 1963 was a momentous year in many ways. It was really the beginning of the 60s in terms of the cultural shift and the first Beatles records and so on, but it was also a momentous year in politics. Yet I can only remember one sentence, clearly one sentence that I heard in the year 1963. I was at secondary school at a club at the school that evening, and I remember somebody coming into the room, and 10 seconds later the person in charge stood up and said, and I can hear it as clearly as if it was yesterday, "President Kennedy has been shot 3 times in the head, and he is dead." I'm told that 40,000 books have been written about that event and about President Kennedy more generally. I must say I haven't actually read any of them, but so I'm not really going to deal with who killed him, but I think I have been convinced that the ballistic evidence is that it couldn't just have been Lee Harvey Oswald, and clearly many people speculate about who else is involved, and I'm told that Robert Kennedy Jr., his nephew, is going to write a book coming out next year saying that the CIA were involved. Now, the best way to get mythologized is to die. I don't think I've got time. The best way to get mythologized is to die young, but I suppose the most interesting question in this debate is what was JF Kennedy really like? What was he all about? Now, he had a lot going for him, as Christine Graham has reminded us. He wasn't just young, he was glamorous, he was charismatic, he was eloquent, he taught the language of change, and there was a remarkable contrast between the politics that he represented in America and what was happening in the UK at the time. Conservative members probably agree with me. It was the end of the old Conservative Party when the grandees in 1963 picked the 14th Earl of Hume as the next Prime Minister. And after that, the Conservative Party modernised itself. So he did have a lot that contributed to the myth. But there have, of course, been many debunkers since then. And I think some people have gone too far. I think the feminist critique of his attitude to women is probably valid, certainly valid in fact, but others have gone too far, like George Caravan. In an article in The Scotsman a month ago, he said he was a fraud, he was a liar, he generated cynicism about the effectiveness of democratic politics. I think all that went too far. And then he said, quite strangely, that he won the election in 1960 through denying millions of black Americans the vote. Now, in fact, the exact opposite of that is the truth. I would urge people to read a really interesting article in The Guardian yesterday by Candace Allen, who basically said it was the black vote that won Kennedy the 1960 election, and that is also what is stated in Theodore White's book, The Making of the President, 1960. So he was, okay, he can be criticised in retrospect for not moving faster, but he tried to get the Civil Rights Bill through, and of course it was Congress that blocked it. And a book that's recently come out, I've only read a review of it, The Letters of JFK, apparently has many letters between Kennedy and Martin Luther King, showing his commitment to the civil rights movement. And of course Lyndon Johnson, partly out of respect and in memory of JF Kennedy, made sure that that bill went through Congress the following year. Now, a lot, of course, has been written about foreign affairs and nuclear weapons and his role in that. I think he learned a lot of lessons from the fiasco of the Bay of Pigs. And again, the correspondence with Khrushchev in that book shows them both trying to hold the line against their hardliners. And I think that resulted, for example, in the Test Ban Treaty of 1963. So I think there were quite positive things in terms of his role in foreign affairs and nuclear weapons. MAD was referred to, mutually assured destruction, by Christine Graham. But let's be honest about this. MAD is a lot better than the first strike madness that many of his advisers were advocating at the time. I think I'm more or less out of time. I think there's a lot of controversy about whether he would have got involved in Vietnam, and I think, in a sense, part of the appeal is that people feel he might have been able to stop the disaster of the Vietnam War, and there is some evidence, which I have no time to go into, which does suggest that. But I don't really know the answer to that question. There are many uncertainties about him. There are clearly many controversies about him, but I think it's absolutely appropriate to commemorate today what was a defining moment of the 1960s, but also a key moment in modern American history.
Many thanks. And due to the large number of members still wishing to speak in this debate, I'm minded to accept a motion under Rule 8.14.3 that the debate be extended by up to 30 minutes. Mr Lyle, would you move such a motion?
Moved.
Thank you very much. So the question is, are we agreed to extend the debate? We are. Many thanks. I now call David Torrance to be followed by Jackson Carlaw. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would like to thank Richard Lyle for bringing the motion to commemorate the 50th anniversary of assassination of American President John F. Kennedy to the Chamber. I was only 2 years old when President Kennedy was assassinated. I don't remember a feeling in the air after it happened. I don't remember a powerful reaction the whole world had to this earth-shattering moment. I don't even remember how upset my parents' family must have felt afterwards. But you don't have to be able to remember that day to understand the profound impact that President Kennedy had on our world. JFK's numerous achievements on the domestic and international stages created an image of a man who deserves our utmost respect, and one can only imagine how different our world would be had his life not been cruelly cut short. JFK had a vision for peace and prosperity the world over. He loved his country and cared deeply and passionately about civil rights, economic prosperity, and scientific innovation through space exploration. Given the nature of the times, much of his focus was spent on world politics, in particular on relations with the Soviet Union. A reminder we have of JFK's humanity is that his presidency experienced many highs and many lows. One of these lows was the failed Bay of Pigs invasion near the beginning of his presidency in 1961. The attack had been largely planned before he took office, meaning that he was briefed and after being elected and approved the plan but without having much time to think about it before the invasion was launched. From this experience, Kennedy learned that he'd have to develop a better strategy for US-Soviet relations when rushing into armed conflict. It was his desire to avoid superpower skirmishes that helped him bring the world back from the brink of nuclear war in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. This time, Kennedy had been involved in the conflict from the beginning and was able to remain calm even while the world was preparing to duck and cover, and an American plane was shot down, killing the pilot. The achievement of a resolution through direct negotiation with the USSR reinforced Kennedy's view that reconciliation was achievable. His new views were on display during his commencement address on the 10th of June 1963 at American University in Washington, D.C., also 50 years ago this year. In his speech, he says, "I have therefore chosen this time and place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and the truth is too rarely perceived, and that is the most important topic on earth, peace. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time. He went on to announce his willingness to negotiate with the Soviets towards an early agreement on a comprehensive test ban treaty, which resulted in a nuclear test ban treaty later that year. He also declared that he would not conduct nuclear tests in the atmosphere, so long as other states refrained from testing there as well, an attempt, as he says, to make clear our good faith and strong convictions on this matter. This speech signalled the climax of a dramatic growth in President Kennedy's character over the course of his short, incomplete presidency, and shows his aspirations for world peace, something I think we all could stand to take some time to refocus on. In closing, I'd like to take a moment to share with you an excerpt from one of his final speeches. On the 13th of November 1963, only days before President Kennedy was assassinated, the Scottish Black Watch Band performed for the President and over 1,000 gathered guests on the White House South Lawn during their American tour. JFK shared these words to a gathered crowd on the importance of American-Scottish connections. "We are proud to have a Black Watch here," he says, "because they are a Scottish regiment, and that green and mystic country has sent hundreds of thousands of Scottish men and women to the United States, and they have been among our finest citizens. And we are proud to have them here, because, speaking personally, the history of Scotland captured me at a very young age. The United States, in fact, all of us, love, I suppose, a lost cause, and on occasions the history of Scotland has been a lost cause, but in some ways they have triumphed, but perhaps more today than ever before." It is no surprise to me that Richard Lyle felt compelled to call this motion on the 50th anniversary of JFK's assassination, and I thank him again for it. President Kennedy felt a deep connection to our great country, just as many of us felt a deep connection to him and his unparalleled leadership. Let us take this anniversary of his death to reflect on many leadership lessons we can learn from him, and to renew our faith in our cause, our country, as he would have us do.
Thank you very much. Now Colin Jackson-Carlaw to be followed by Jamie Hepburn. 4 minutes, please.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official. President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago. I think most people have seen Walter Cronkite's broadcast in which he brought the official confirmation to the world of the President's assassination. I was only 4 years old, and surprisingly, I can actually remember where I was when I heard about Kennedy, because it was the following day. And I just could not understand why my grandparents were so uninvolved in the first episode of Doctor Who, because I was enthralled. The President has been killed, they told me by way of explanation. Yeah, well, who, whatever. And then blow me, because of that man Kennedy, we had to wait and have the first episode repeated the following week, and a whole fortnight before I could find out what subsequently transpired. That was the perspective of a 4-year-old at the time. But back to the Kennedy, because I've read plenty about him since and his family, and despite all of that, I'm afraid I remain fairly unimpressed. His father was a fascist-supporting ambassador to the United Kingdom, who did all he could to frustrate any US involvement in disrupting the progress of Hitler and the Nazis. His mother acquiesced in his father's sanctioning of a lobotomy in his sister. His younger brother abandoned a woman to drown in a car crash. He and his brother Bobby, when in office, shared women, took drugs and behaved reprehensibly, and in a way that would lead to their being hounded out of office today. They gave J. Edgar Hoover all the material he needed to effectively blackmail the presidency of the United States. His father fixed votes in the presidential election in 1960 that saw him elected as president. He initiated America's substantive involvement in Vietnam. He was responsible for the Bay of Pigs fiasco. And it was his successor, LBJ, who did all the heavy lifting on the landmark civil rights legislation. And it wasn't just in memory to JFK. LBJ was personally hugely committed to driving through that civil rights legislation, and it was LBJ who drove through most of the social legislation which remains at the heart of the United States today. Now, to Kennedy's credit, he conducted himself heroically when his ship he was commanding, PT-109, was attacked and sunk in the Second World War. His single-handed rescuing of members of his crew demonstrated outstanding and immense personal courage. And although there are some who carp over the details and the Cold War consequences, he deserves every credit for the way he managed the Cuban Missile Crisis. Deborah Devonshire, the Dowager Duchess, and the youngest and now only surviving Mitford's sister, knew him well. JFK's sister, Kathleen, known as Kick, married her brother-in-law. Both Kick and her husband were to die in an air tragedy, the consequence of which was that Deborah's husband acceded to the dukedom. The Devonshires and the Kennedys stayed in touch. The Devonshires attended the inauguration, and JFK, when President, visited Chatsworth, to the wide-eyed astonishment, I think, of the people who were queuing up to tour the house on that day. And in her autobiography, Wait for Me, she testifies at first hand to his immense charm, to his vitality, to his sense of purpose. Now, obviously, for those of us under a certain age, that is something we never saw, but I defer to her assessment. The Kennedys had charm, and that charm, of course, was manifested in Jackie, who created Camelot and captured the imagination of the wider world. But like Camelot, it was an idealised fiction. In my view, JFK is remembered because his assassination was the first globally televised news event of its kind. In 1963, people in the US and across the world shared the shock and the raw emotion of his assassination, of Dallas, of Lee Harvey Oswald, of Jack Ruby, of the flight home to Washington, of Jackie's blood-spattered suit, of the horse with the reversed boots, of John Jr.'s salute to his father at the funeral, and because of the Zapruder film footage. This was a president who represented the youth, glamour and ambition of the post-Second World War generation. They mourned the what might have been of all that youth, vigour and purpose being cut off so dramatically before their eyes and in his prime. But it cannot disguise that he was flawed and must remain a largely unknown quantity.
Thank you very much. Now calling Jamie Hepburn to be followed by Tavish Scott.
Thank you very much, President Officer. Can I begin by thanking Richard Lyle for bringing forward this debate? The question is often positive. Where were you when Kennedy was assassinated? I should declare I wasn't born for another 15.5 years, almost to the day, so I do not have any personal memories of the incident, but it is, I think, one of the most pivotal moments of the mid-20th century. I very much welcome the chance to reflect on that by way of this debate. 4 minutes of a speech, indeed this whole debate, the length of a whole member's debate, probably wouldn't do justice to any life, let alone that of Kennedy. But I do think it is worthwhile us having the debate, as I say. Kennedy's links to Scotland were not many-fold. The motion does, of course, refer to the incident where his father, as the ambassador from the United States to the Court of St James, sent him to meet those United States citizens who had been caught up in a German attack on a ship that was sailing for America. Today's Daily Record refers to another that was highlighted by David Torrance, the last remaining member of the Black Watch pipe band, was interviewed in today's Daily Record, and that pipe band, of course, played at the funeral of President Kennedy. That funeral had been planned so meticulously by his widow, Jacqueline Kennedy, and the origins of Camelot therein. There is a trend in assessing the life of President Kennedy to oscillate between, on the one hand, hagiography to demonology, on the other hand, some of which we may have just heard, if I can respectfully say, to Mr Carlaw. I think the truth is somewhere between, it has to be said. I think certainly in his personal life, I do not think he exhibited huge qualities of exceptional personal morality. I think that is probably fair enough to say. But in his public life, there were achievements. President Officer, there were many. I won't reflect on many beyond one, and it has been mentioned, those 13 days of October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy ignored the more bellicose, belligerent demands of the American military leadership, epitomised by the head of the American Air Force, Curtis LeMay, demanding military action. He charted a different way with more sound counsel from some wiser heads, and he avoided that mutually assured destruction that Christine Graham referred to. It would have obliterated the entire world. I think we should reflect, though, that Kennedy's greatest achievements were those that were probably never made. His was a life unfulfilled, as the title of the book, the biography by Robert Dalek of Kennedy refers to. It was, as I've said, a pivotal moment. The assassination of Kennedy was a pivotal moment, because we then have to ask, what might have been what would have happened if he lived. It is, of course, by necessity revisionist. I think the first thing we can accept is he would have absolutely won the 1964 election. His assessment was correct that Goldwater would have been the Republican candidate. Johnson decisively defeated Goldwater, and Kennedy would have as well. There are indications of how things might have been different. The first is in that commencement address at the American University that David Torrance referred to. I want to quote from it as well. I think a salient point he made in talking about our relations with the Soviet Union. He said, "From the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet, we all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal." Words, only words, of course, Presiding Officer, but it was well received in the Soviet Union. Indeed, the speech was made in its wholeness available in Soviet press, which was very unusual at that time. Khrushchev received it well, and it was followed up by the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. We know his last executive order, referred to by Richard Lyle as well, planned the beginning of the withdrawal of American troops from Vietnam. We know also that he had established a back channel to Cuba. There was discussion about normalising relations between Cuba and America, and we could have perhaps avoided the 50 years of strained relations that have followed since. We don't know what would have happened if Kennedy would have lived, but I do think there is enough evidence to suggest that a different course would have been charted. There would have been an ambitious agenda for global peace. That was all lost on the streets of the 22nd of November 1963 by an assassin's bullet. Of course, that is shrouded in mystery and will sadly probably remain so for evermore.
Thanks so much. Now Colin Tavish-Scott, to be followed by George Adam. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Richard Lyle was quite right to recall that most American politicians, indeed to this day, still pray in aid John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Quite many do around the world as well. But all of that has also led to some of the greatest put-downs in American politics as well. The one that I remember best is the 1988 vice presidential debate, in which the Republican Dan Quayle was holding forth about his experience in office compared to that of Kennedy's when he entered the White House. He was up against Senator Lloyd Benston, who was quite a bit older than Quayle. And Benston pulled himself up to his full 6'2", looked over the podium and said, "I knew Jack Kennedy, and believe me, Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy." I suspect many of us would have been pretty proud of that kind of political put-down. 30 years ago, I spent some time in an American history class with students of my own age discussing presidents, and the class teacher asked us to name the president we'd like to most study and most learn about in terms of what they'd done for their country. And inevitably, many chose Jefferson or Lincoln or Eisenhower or, of course, Washington. I said Kennedy, and I said it for two reasons. Firstly, there was the fascination that members have described this afternoon about what kind of person he was. Yes, flawed, but utterly magisterial in many other ways, and what he brought to his politics and what he brought to his country. You have to remember that time of change was about the new frontier, about the new beginning, about replacing a war hero. Eisenhower had served his country in so many ways. It was a changing America, and Kennedy epitomised that, grabbed it and drove it in a way which I don't think anyone else could have done. And just 5 weeks ago, for the first time in my life, I actually got to Dallas and took my family to Dealey Plaza and went into the museum, the book depository that is now a museum, up to that 6th floor and looked out that window. And my son said to me, "Dad, are those two crosses on the road? Are they what I think they are?" And they are. They mark the spot where the first bullet hit Kennedy, and then the second one some yards further down the road. We walked round Dealey Plaza. We walked behind a picket fence. You look at that museum. I don't know all these conspiracy theories. I've read quite a lot of those books, I must confess, to Malcolm Chisholm, and I still don't know what I believe. But what I do know, having been there, is that it is an awful lot closer when you're there than you see on the television or you see in a Kevin Costner movie. We'll never know who killed Kennedy, but you cannot... can I just make my speech, if you forgive me, Jamie? We'll never know what killed Kennedy, but I suspect even after reading the Warren Commission's report, neither will America. He did, as others have mentioned, bring forward the civil rights legislation. And I think the point I'd make to Jackson Carlaw is that, yes, in Robert Caro's incomparable book about LBJ, he describes how that legislation passed through Congress and what Johnson did to get it through Congress, particularly against his own party. But the point on that is it would never have got through had it not been for Kennedy's death. That is the sad reflection that Caro, and the conclusion that Caro comes to in that very important text about American political history, that the only way that legislation passed the Congress was because Johnson was able to twist, cajole and make senators and congressmen recognise the importance of the legacy that was civil rights legislation and therefore rightly get it through their legislative and lawmaking systems. The other, I think, enduring legacy of Kennedy is his speech-making. His inaugural in '61 was, for many of us, the defining text of how to write a speech. Believe me, most of us will, including me, will never get there, but it's nice to just try. As an ex-speechwriter, it's nice to occasionally try. And I think Obama does do that. I think Obama's speech in Chicago when he won was up there, but not quite as good, but it was up there. And many, many fine men and women will seek to get to the top of the rhetorical Everest that Kennedy created. And in this, the 150th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address, when you can remember a speech can also be 2 minutes, not 22. I think it is important that his legacy about the power of speech, the power of words, the power to swing an audience, the power to move a country, was possibly his most enduring feature that the world will never forget, whether you were born at a time when you can remember or at a time when, as many of us, we can't. We'll certainly always remember JFK.
Many, many thanks. Now I call on George Adam to be followed by James Kennedy. James Kelly, forgive me.
James Kennedy. I was a bit concerned there for a minute, Presiding Officer. I thought I had something that somebody was going to follow me that I couldn't compete with. Presiding Officer, I'd like to thank Richard Lyle for bringing this debate here. I, like Jamie Hepburn, wasn't born at the time. I was born in 1969. I often hear stories from my mother and father about where they were during that period. You know, but why would someone of my generation be inspired by the legacy of John F. Kennedy? Well, his administration, yes, it was glamorous, yes, it was different, but it was younger. It was actually the first person president that was born in the 20th century to hold office in the White House at that time as well. And there's been much said about the Camelot legend that was mentioned as well, because they actually did believe they could change the world. With that youthfulness, there was this ideal of trying to change the world and make it a better place. But Tavish Scott is quite right. It's his words that are extremely important, and these are the things that inspire us. You know, things like there was a quote I saw earlier today that the problems of the world cannot possibly be solved by sceptics or cynics whose horizons are limited by the obvious realities. We need men, and nowadays we would say women, who can dream of things that never were. And these are things that, when you hear that as a young man, you know, or young woman, it inspires you to actually, especially if you're a politician, to actually want to be involved in that process and to try and change the world. You know, some of the things that who wouldn't have been interested in my generation, who wouldn't want to get involved in all that, who want to see what it was. Was it the glamour? Yes, there was glamour involved in there as well. But I think the important part is exactly what Kennedy said, and many of the things that he actually done as well. You know, some of the things I define myself in my own politics is something that's mentioned here in another quote from him: economic growth without social progress lets the great majority of people remain in poverty, while privileged few reap the benefits of rising abundance. Now, these are relevant words here and now in debates that we have in this chamber now, and President Kennedy was saying that in the 1960s. You know, we in my own constituency office, we have we look to the Kennedy thing. David McCartney, my constituency manager, is actually he loves Bobby Kennedy. That's his hero. He sees Bobby as the one that he would aspire to be like. My wife Stacey, quite rightly, when one of our constituents came up to us after the election and said, "Oh, here's the First Lady of Paisley," it was Jackie Kennedy she was thinking about when someone said that. It wasn't any other First Lady that left office after that. And, you know, some of the things that he did during his time, in his short time, and, you know, I've mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the world was in the brink. You know, and I have a personal connection, or a constituency connection there as well. When Ken McGinley, a campaigning nuclear veteran, was in Christmas Island, and he actually was one of the soldiers who was experimented on by the British Army, and he wrote to Mrs Kennedy after this happened, because he was inspired, because it was John F. Kennedy who actually had the nuclear test ban that brought that in a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he actually wrote because of this, and he got a letter back and a picture back from Mrs Kennedy saying she thanked him for his support and everything else. And these are the things that make a difference in people's lives. Here's a man that's now in the kind of later years in his life, and he is still talking about that. That's still a major part of what he did, you know. But he was a man of change. He actually believed in changing things. You know, under Kennedy's power, you know, the federal government, women were actually paid the same amount of money as men. Now, that was radical in the 1960s. In some places, it's quite a radical ideal now in the private sector. But that was something that they pushed for there as well. And in the 1960s, another thing that we have here is that 0.0035% of the FBI, as a government body, were African American. And they were nearly all chauffeurs. The Kennedy administration went down the line of trying to make sure that this part of the population in America could get the opportunity to actually to aspire to be members of the FBI or do other to get involved in other things as well. So his death came as a great shock to everyone. The Andy Warhol exhibition that we had in here as well, you only had to look through that, presiding officer, to see how much an effect it had on someone like him as well. I would say that how you can sum up the legacy, and if you just give me this second here, presiding officer, is the fact that Oliver Stone's Nixon movie has a line in it where the character playing Nixon looks at a picture. It probably never happened, but he looks at a picture on the wall and he says, "You remind them of who they want to be." He says, "I remind them of what they really are." And that was the difference between whether he was good, bad or indifferent. The difference in the legacy of John Fitzgerald Kennedy is that he inspires us to be what we want to be, and we achieve everything that we can. And that, for me, is what makes a difference.
Thanks very much. Now call on James Kelly to be followed by Willie Coffey.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I congratulate Richard Lyle in bringing this motion to the Chamber? I think the variety and the depth of the speeches shows not only how much Kennedy inspired many of the members in this chamber, but also the great deal of interest, not just in the assassination, but in the political legacy. I was only a month old when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, so I don't remember that incident, but I grew up in a house as the oldest of 7 children, and my parents were always really interested in politics, although not actively involved. And I was very aware of the virtues of the Kennedy administration and the positive aspects of that. So it's something that has always greatly interested me. Interestingly, before I came up to do this speech, I've got Burnside Primary in the gallery with me, and one young pupil said to me, what is it that made John F. Kennedy famous? And I think there are 2 aspects to it. There's the actual assassination itself, and we'll see more of these photographs and images tomorrow. But there's no doubt that that image of an American president driving down a street, then being assassinated in front of thousands of people, and that iconic image of Kennedy with his wife and young family, and the fact that all that can be denied, shocked people, as people like Christine Graham have said, in the beginning of a television age. And I think that's one of the fascinations around all the conspiracy theories also. I think in terms of the politics, I think Jackson Carlaw does the debate a service by bringing an alternative critique to the table. Although I didn't agree with much of it, I think he's right to point out that perhaps all that glitters is not gold. But I think there are 2 things that I would say about Kennedy. I think, interestingly, when you reflect on yesterday's debate on same-sex marriage, a lot of people spoke about how the world had moved on. I think when recently I was talking to my 13-year-old daughter, Erin, about a project she was doing on America, and we were talking about the real challenges that black and Negro people faced in America, how they weren't allowed to ride on certain buses, how there was segregation, how people were murdered and beaten up. And Kennedy took a real stand against all that, and he moved all that on. And perhaps if he hadn't done that, and if Lyndon Johnson hadn't carried that on, we wouldn't have got Barack Obama as President in 2008. So I think he did the world a real service. I think he also showed real leadership during the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's no doubt that if you read back on what happened at that time, we were on the verge, of World War III. And I think the fact that he was right to stand firm and provide real leadership there. I think the other thing I would say, the real lesson of it all for me, is that politics matters. Again, going back to yesterday in the Parliament, we had the tributes to Helen Eadie. And sadly, that's the third occasion in recent months where we've had that, where Brian Adam and David McCletchie have died. And I think the thing that brings everyone together in this chamber, although we have different views and different visions, is that we're in this because politics matters. And I think when you reflect on what John F. Kennedy achieved in his life and in his political career, it shows that you can make a difference in politics. And I think that's something that all politicians, should carry forward in their political careers.
Well done. Now call on Willie Coffey, after which we move to the closing speech from the Minister.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. Can I join colleagues also in thanking Dick Lyle for bringing the motion and President Kennedy to the debating chamber today and providing the Scottish Parliament with an opportunity to remember one of the most influential and charismatic political leaders the world has ever known. Those of us who were around at the time do remember the moment where we were, and I'm no different. Even as a 5-year-old, I recall the moment vividly, being in the house with my mother, sitting at the fireplace when the news flash came over the TV. I knew something awful had happened, but I wasn't sure exactly what it was. But I do recall being incredibly saddened by my mother's reaction to the news, and I knew it was important. 50 years on, almost to the day, and I'm privileged to be able to stand here in our Parliament and give something back to honour the memory of a man who changed the world. Presiding Officer, the Cold War between the West and the Soviet Union was probably at its coldest during Mr Kennedy's presidency, and the disaster of the Bay of Pigs Cuba invasion in 1961 would probably have finished the careers of lesser presidents than JFK. Yet he prevailed, won the support of the American public, and successfully faced down Khrushchev during the Cuban nuclear missile crisis of 1962, succeeding in persuading the Soviets to dismantle their nuclear capability there in return for a reciprocal agreement from the Americans in Italy and Turkey, and also a promise not to invade Cuba. Diplomacy indeed averted disaster for the world. America at that time too was a racially divided country, and the civil rights movement was struggling to gain momentum. President Kennedy must have watched in horror at the events in May 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama, when state-sponsored brutality put down a civil rights event led by Martin Luther King, himself to be assassinated only 5 years after the president. Perhaps JFK could have done more earlier to rid America of apartheid, but his executive orders prohibiting racial discrimination did lay the groundwork for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In many ways, the Kennedy administration was years ahead of its time. He established the Peace Corps in 1961, which my colleague Dick Lyle mentioned, which saw US volunteers working in the Third World to build roads and hospitals and to educate their citizens. He promoted his New Frontier programme, promising federal funding for education, medical care for the elderly, economic aid to rural regions and government intervention to halt the recession at the time. And of course, he declared to an unsuspecting world that America would put a man on the moon before the end of the decade, which of course happened in 1969. So averting a nuclear World War III whilst planning to expand the scientific achievements of mankind beyond our dreams were all pretty impressive achievements in his all too short term in office. Presiding Officer, you would expect us to find a story connecting Jack Kennedy to Scotland, and of course Jamie Hepburn mentioned this. President Kennedy's first speech as a 22-year-old was in what I know to be the Baird Hall of Residence in Sauchiehall Street in Glasgow in 1939, after the Germans had torpedoed the Athenia passenger ship, killing 28 Americans. The way Glasgow reacted to this incident, looking after and caring for all who survived the incident, particularly those American citizens, must have left a hugely positive impression on the young Mr Kennedy, which may well have influenced him later in his years as President. Well, we would like to hope that it did. In summary, Presiding Officer, I feel privileged to be standing here talking about President John F. Kennedy and the important legacy he left us in such a short term of office. He touched the hearts and minds not only of the American people, but throughout the world and here in Scotland too. I might have only been 5 when he was taken from us, but he certainly made an impression in my life. He said, "A man may die, nations may rise and fall, but an idea lives on." Presiding Officer, the ideas and vision of John F. Kennedy certainly live on, and I think the world is a better place because of him. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call on Cabinet Secretary Fiona Hislop to close the debate, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I also would like to congratulate Richard Lyle for securing this debate. I was not born at the date of President Kennedy's death, but the impact of his life has been felt throughout my life. It's been clear in listening to what I think has been a very interesting and poignant debate that the 22nd of November 1963 will forever be marked as a pivotal moment in world history, the day that President John Fitzgerald Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. And he was human and he had flaws, but he also was a leader who provided hope, and hope is the most precious currency for any political leader. I want to touch briefly on a couple of examples of JFK's vision and his impact on Scotland and the world, a vision which makes his death as tragic today as it was 50 years ago. And in doing so, I also want to recognise and celebrate the strong bonds of friendship that exist between Scotland and the US. And on this sad anniversary, we join with our American friends in honouring the memory of their young president and his legacy that lives on to this day. JFK is as famous for his Irish roots and Boston brogue as he was for being the product of the American dream. But as the motion states, and has just been referred to, it was here in Scotland that the 22-year-old son of the US ambassador to the UK first demonstrated his potential as a politician and a leader, and he made his first public speech on behalf of the US government, addressing the American survivors of the German U-boat attack and sinking of the passenger ship Athenia, as they were being cared for by Glasgow, as we've just heard from Willie Coffey. As US President, JFK also had the vision to recognise the perils of nuclear weapons, as a number of members have referred to. In recognising these threats, and as profound today as it was following the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was then that both he and Khrushchev realised it was insane that the power to spark nuclear war should be controlled by 2 individuals, and privately they began exchanging letters which reopened their earlier dialogue on banning nuclear testing. And this was followed, of course, by the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which was signed on the 5th of August 1963 in Moscow, one day before the 18th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. And it took Kennedy 2 months to convince the US public and Senate to support the treaty, a demonstration of how strongly resolute JFK was to do something about the peril of nuclear weapons. As US President, JFK had the vision to imagine a society where people of all races and religions were treated equally. And when Kennedy was elected, of course, in 1960, civil rights was obviously a key issue in the US. And, of course, there were high expectations of the new president. Reluctant to lose support among the southern states, having only narrowly won the election and barely holding control in Congress, instead of trying to pass legislation, Kennedy appointed a large number of African Americans to high-level positions and worked to strengthen the Civil Rights Commission. Then, on 11th of June 1963, the President addressed the nation, promising to introduce major civil rights legislation following the attempt by the then Governor of Alabama to block 2 black students from entering the University of Alabama. Presiding Officer, when I was in the US this summer, I had the privilege of meeting the current Mayor of Alabama as part of the anniversary around civil rights this year. At that point in 1963, not long after the proposal and the address by JFK, 200,000 Americans gathered for the march in Washington, and then Martin Luther King delivered his momentous I Have a Dream speech. And the march helped a comprehensive civil rights bill clear several hurdles in Congress and win endorsement from both House and Senate Republican leaders. Unfortunately, Kennedy was assassinated in November '63 before the bill could pass, but of course, as we've heard, it was President Johnson who was able to sign it into law as a tribute to his fallen predecessor. But perhaps Kennedy's most ambitious vision was to commit putting a man on the moon. In 1961, the Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space, creating the impression among Americans that the US was falling behind in the space race. Kennedy understood that to restore the faith of Americans, the US government would not just have to match but surpass the Soviets. So in a speech on the 25th of May 1961, before a joint session of Congress, Kennedy called for an investment of billions of dollars in order to achieve the goal of putting a man on the moon by the end of the decade. Skeptics questioned the ability of NASA to deliver this, but of course we know on the 20th of July 1969, the crew of Apollo 11 realised President Kennedy's dream and became the first spaceflight to land humans on the moon. Now, that was my first memory of television and watching that event, and it was a tremendous point in history. And, of course, in terms of the impact, that also is a tribute to the work of JFK. But as also, as Tavish Scott has said, as well as his vision, his powerful oratory and his ability to capture the mood of the moment is one that I think is particularly important to reflect on. And one of the finest examples of this came a few months before his death in his visit to West Berlin on the 26th of June 1963. Amidst the tensions of the Cold War, Kennedy spoke about the United States' support for West Germany some 22 months after the Soviet-backed East Germans had erected the Berlin Wall. Although his message was aimed as much at the Soviets as it was at the people of West Berlin, it's best remembered for his compelling statement of empathy, Ich bin ein Berliner. And in that simple phrase, spoken in their mother tongue, Kennedy conveyed powerfully how the United States would stand with the people of West Berlin against oppression. And I want to bring my speech to a close by reflecting and using some other statements of JFK. And I thought it was interesting that in 1962, Kennedy ignored advice from key advisers and tried to pass medical care for workers over 65 under Social Security. In a message as part to Congress in February 62, he said, on this measure of healthcare, for one true measure of a nation is its success in fulfilling the promise of a better life for each of its members. Let this be the measure of our nation. And when President Kennedy addressed the Irish Parliament in Dublin on the 28th of June 1963, he said of Ireland, "The achievement of nationhood is not an end but a beginning. Self-determination can no longer mean isolation, and the achievement of national independence today means withdrawal from the old status only to return to the world scene with a new one." And to reflect perhaps on James Kelly's remarks, that I thought was a very fitting and very good speech, I just want to end with one quote that perhaps, presiding officer, for this place and this time is most appropriate. And I quote, "So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved." Presiding officer, I think this has been an excellent debate with excellent speeches and a very fitting way to mark the memory of a man who had made such impact on this world.
I agree. Thank you very much. I now suspend this meeting of Parliament until 2 o'clock.